Hello. In this presentation, I want to talk about Lesson 2 and Chapters 17 and 18 briefly. Chapter 17 has a lot of components to it. Begins with the populist movement. A lot is misunderstood about the populace. It's basically a movement that grew out of the frustration of farmers who were increasingly going into debt after the Civil War. And one of the big issues there was this, what the Foner refers to as the silver issue. And I just want to say a couple things about that to kind of shed some more light on it. The farmers were deeply in debt, or many farmers were, not all. And their backing of the silver issue was related to them being in debt. By having coinage of silver put into circulation, or more of it, the farmers were aiming to what's called inflate the money supply, which would put more money in circulation, which would, in essence, devalue money, make it worth less. And the aim there was that would provide some relief for their debt. But of course, at the same time, those who were holding the debt, like banks and others, were very much against inflating the money supply and wanted to keep the value of money where it was on the gold standard. And that is, reminiscent or indicative of a general uh, conflict, I guess, or tension uh, in this society, even today, about money, whether to have more money in circulation or less. More money in circulation, the danger there is inflation, which basically devalues money. And on the other hand, the tightening of money or taking money out of circulation, the danger there is the possibility of pushing the country into slow growth or a recession. The Chapter 17 also talks about the rise of what's called Jim Crow in the South during or after the Civil War, during an era called Reconstruction, which basically was 1865 to 1877. There was an attempt to bring out about some measure of racial equality in the United States, especially in the southern states or the former Confederacy. And then after 1877, at the end of Reconstruction, over the next 20 or 30 years, Southern white supremacists, basically eroded and took away many, if not most or all, of the gains that African Americans had made during Reconstruction, and instituted a form of legalized segregation in the South. That was going to last all the way up until the 1950s and 60s at least, into the more recent civil rights movement. Also want to say a couple things about the exclusion of Chinese in the 1880s, 1882 to be specific. Uh, Immigration from China began in earnest to the United States about 1850. And for the first 20 years or so of that immigration, somewhere around 200 to 300,000 people from China had entered the United States. About 150,000 of them had stayed. And during those 20 years, from about 1850 to 1870, there was a lot of negative reaction to the presence of Chinese immigrants, particularly on the West Coast, where most of them were in California, Oregon, Washington. But that opposition or anti-Chinese sentiment at the time was relatively random and unorganized. But then in the 1870s, because of an economic recession, many people were thrown out of work, especially in the West. Unemployment rose, and in that climate of worker dissatisfaction, a anti-Chinese movement arose, where labor leaders, for example, were in a way pushing this movement and making the case that the presence of Chinese immigrants was stealing jobs from white Americans, and that they were tools or pawns of the capitalists that were using the presence of Chinese immigration to push down wages and to prevent white workers from organizing. So there's a larger lesson there. The larger lesson is that attitudes and policies about immigration in this country have always been closely linked with the economy. When the economy is doing well and jobs are plenty, then attitudes about immigration are more muted. There's not a big outcry, but when there's times of economic dislocation, recession, rising unemployment, then there's often an outcry about immigration and calls for restricting immigration. Also want to talk about one of the big themes of chapter 17 was it's called different names, but some people call it the rise of the U.S. to world power status, or the acquisition of overseas empire by the United States. There's actually a question about this in your homework for this lesson. There's a lot of factors involved there, but one of the big ones was in the area of capability. Beginning in about the 1880s, Congress began authorizing funds for construction of a modern navy. And from about the 1880s till about the end of the century, 1900, the United States went from a really second-class, even third-class naval power into a first-class naval power. And had a modern, and at that time, naval technology was undergoing very rapid changes in the size of ships and engines and the thickness of hulls and the quality of the steel, the size of the guns and the accuracy and all that. And so that Navy that was constructed during that time, which became known as the New Navy, gave the United States a very powerful capability to extend and protect its interest really around the world, around the globe. So that was key there. The economy is also involved in that, of course, and missionary, activity and so forth. But without that capability, the country was really not in a position to expand overseas like it did. Of course, that expansion really, in the textbook, it kind of sounds like most Americans were on board with that. But in reality, a lot of Americans were very uncomfortable with that, especially at the turn of the century when the United States annexed the Philippines, which resulted in a war between the United States and Filipino nationalists, which was extremely costly, very bloody, and covered by newspapers. And Americans became very much dissatisfied and disillusioned with the acquisition of that kind of an empire. Then we move on to chapter 18, and chapter 18 is about progressivism and the progressive movement, which is a very large and important period in American history, which goes from about 1900 to about 1920. Progressivism is about many, many things, as you will read in the chapter. But one thing that I wanted to point out was that once progressivism, or the movement for change and reform, moves to the national level in the 19-teens under Wilson, there are 4 amendments that are passed and ratified to the Constitution, collectively known as the Progressive Amendments, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. And those are very important and really changed the way the federal government in particular engaged in American life. Like, for example, the amendment which authorized the income tax gave the federal government access to revenues that were unheard of before. Of course, the Prohibition Amendment was often seen as an experiment that didn't work out. And then the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was also a very important development during the Progressive Era. Well, that's it for now. I don't want to make this video too long like I did the last one. So I'm going to sign off and I'll post this up, and I will see you in the next lesson, lesson 3.